going to cover 3 bigger topics. We're going to talk about your duck migration forecast series. We're going to talk a little bit about eastern mallards and this cool thing called stable isotopes that's kind of taken over my mind.
We do a migration forecast every Monday morning for the next 7 days. So this isn't a migration report. It actually tells you where ducks are going to be.
I shoot a duck with a band, and I get a certificate that tells me where that duck was banded and how old it was, and maybe it's a hatchie or maybe it's an adult. I think a duck hunter thinks that's where that duck came from.
Which is possible that they're in places that we don't survey. Or the U.S. production is in the dumpster. And we're just producing that many fewer ducklings per hen in the U.S. for some reason.
Welcome back to Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. I'm your host, Joel Brice, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mike Schumer of the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Dr. Schummer is a renowned waterfowl ecologist, a leading expert on eastern mallards, and a frequent research partner on Delta-funded studies. If you've been wondering where the ducks are, Schummer is your man, and we'll be spending some time discussing how his duck migration forecast series is calculated and how weather affects changes in duck distribution. Plus, we'll explore his Delta-backed stable isotope studies, including eastern mallards and, most recently, his work charting the primary origins of Atlantic Flyway's teal, gadwall, and wigeon. With that introduction, let's get started. Dr. Mike Schumer, welcome to the Delta Waterfowl podcast.
Thanks for having me, Joel. Really appreciate being here.
Yeah, that's good. Very good. We've worked together loosely for a growing number of years, but this will probably be our longest single conversation, don't you think?
Yeah, I'd say so. We've chatted back and forth a whole bunch and worked with all your great staff, but you and I one-on-one, way over in the East, right? So we don't connect face-to-face a ton.
No, not a ton. So Mike, can I call you Mike on this one?
Yeah, we're all good.
Yeah, I always think it's kind of my standing little joke, and I'd say, do you call yourself Mike Schumer or do you call yourself Dr. Mike Schumer? Which one is important to you?
It's not. I actually had a student this morning in a meeting, a master's student, that said, "Hey, do you prefer to be called Mike or Dr. Schumer?" And I said, "Whatever you're comfortable with." Honestly, it doesn't. I'm not an academic at heart. I'm not an stuffy uppity person, and I don't have that ego, so I'm good with whatever.
Well,
we use the handle Dr. Mike on the Fowl Weather podcast just because it has a ring to it and it's worked, and
instant credibility.
It works.
Yeah. No, I kind of laugh. I think I saw this on a TV show, Mike. I saw someone said that it was someone who was a doctor, but they weren't a medical doctor, and so their distinction as to whether or not someone should use doctor as their name or not was if you're in a restaurant, somebody says, "Help, I need a doctor." Would you go running? And if you wouldn't go running, then you're not a doctor. So that was kind of the punchline in a comedy. But
that's
hey,
fun.
You earned it. You earned it. So if you want to be called Dr. Mike Schumer on this entire podcast, we'll go with that.
Nope. All I did was follow. I say this to folks all the time, Joel, is all I ever did was follow organic leads and just get up every morning and do really good work for the ducks and wetlands and the students, and it's all it is. I just grew up a duck hunter and just kept chasing leads, and it's been fun. And so somehow, I got a PhD and doctor got put in front of my name, I guess. But I don't hang my hat on it. I mean, I don't want to demean it. It is a lot of work, a lot of hours, and thankful for the opportunity that the people before me provided, including Delta. One of my first waterfowl in Eglin, North Dakota, in a trailer working with Dr. Frank and folks. And so, but it's a long road, and somehow I ended up where I'm at, and I'll take whatever. I mean, again, I find as long as people don't call me something derogatory, I'm happy with it. So.
No, we're not going there. No, you're not going there. You're a very bright and talented academic, and And I like you have that manager's mindset, at least from our interactions, and I really appreciate that. I do want to get people an understanding of who you are. So
Hmm.
currently, you are an associate professor at State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, correct?
Yep. Longest university name in history, I think. Yes.
It is long. You'll hear a lot of people. Well, I'll hear it as SUNY, right? SUNY ESF.
Yeah.
That's a
ESF is kind of the tagline, what we go by. Yeah. Yeah.
so that's a quick way. But honestly, preparing for this podcast, Mike, you've been at other places, i-
Yeah.
employed in a permanent status. Can you talk a little bit about your background, Mike? Just before we get into the meaty subject of today's discussion, can you share with the listener your background?
Yeah, and I'll try to be a bit brief, but coming out of rural Western New York, originally kind of south of Buffalo, New York, Pennsylvania border, looked at I looked at going in the Army for sure when I was younger, and then kind of landed on forestry as a thing. I knew I wanted to work outdoors, so I went to a small private college in the Adirondack Mountains, Paul Smith College, for associate's degree in forestry, and then I actually went to ESF, where I'm at now, to finish my bachelor's. Decided that that wasn't for me. Actually got a job, in forestry. I did work with the timber industry several summers and such, and got a job with Delta, as I'd noted, only for like 1 month, right, out in the Dakotas between my junior senior year and forestry school, and then worked for Fish and Wildlife Service in Northeast South Dakota. Really started to get into the kind of bird world. Got a master's degree at SEMO, Southeast Missouri State. So big fan of the boot heel of Missouri and people in that great part of and then was lucky enough right after that to go up to Long Point on Lake Erie and work with Dr. Scott Petrie, and did a bunch of sea duck work on Lake Ontario. And that kind of launched me into a kind of long-term career in waterfowl. Met my wife there, Sarah Fleming. She works with Ducks Unlimited. And from there, we moved to Maine. I was the waterfowl biologist and on the technical section for the Atlantic Flyway for the state of Maine for a while. And then Sarah and I both got jobs in Mississippi at Mississippi State University with Kaminsky. I was doing my postdoc with him, doing research on some of the weather stuff we might talk about today. Sarah was doing her master's degree on wetland reserve program lands. And then kind of a real interesting story. I know this is getting a little in the weeds, but this is kind of a cool one, Joel, is I'd applied for the science coordinator of the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture. And I think like 3 or 4 people had turned it down, and they finally ended up with me. And they offered me that job. I believe it was Ron Reynolds called me and offered me that job. But Sarah had just accepted a position with Ducks Unlimited in Michigan. And the day before. And I'd already had a career, and I knew I'd land on my feet, and I really wanted to see her do well in the waterfowl world. And so I actually turned that job down. It was like a GS-12. And went to Michigan and was unemployed for like 8 months. Lived in this little cottage on a lake outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, while Sarah was working with DU. And I finished that moist soil plant book that we have out, and then like a publication per month, and swam the dogs in the lake. And at that time we had a black lab and 2 Chesapeakes. And so I'd swim in the lake and fish and just write. I didn't even put on civilian clothes for like 8 months, I don't, or professional clothes for like 8 months, I don't think. So that was fun. And then she got a job in New York. We moved over here. I ended up going back to Long Point as their senior scientist, and then got a job at SUNY Oswego, which is another State University of New York school, as a visiting professor of zoology. Was their ornithologist, and then kind of I'll say weaseled my way into ESF. I started as adjunct, and then just built a program where I don't think that they could let me go. I don't want to like flex an ego there, but it was like we built something out working on waterfowl wetlands. It was pretty awesome. And so that's the story, and that's where we're at now. And Sarah's worked her way up in that organization that she's been working for years. And I'm doing the associate professor thing now. I know that's long, but it's like, I think my comment, Joel, to folks, if there's like students listening on here and such, is that none of this, if you do it right, I don't feel like it's linear, right? It's chasing the next cool thing to work in the outdoors.
It does take a little while for someone, chasing that broader wildlife management career position, it does take a little while. And a lot of times you see people shift around 3, 4, 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
Very seldom do you just land in that spot and arrive and just grow until retirement. I always think it's kind of funny going through college myself, going into that wildlife discipline. I had friends who, both future husband and wife, were in the outdoor discipline, and wow, what a tough match for both
Yeah.
people to get employment in their dream job. But it sounds like you guys have pulled it off. I've often said, a future wildlife manager should marry somebody in medicine, right?
Yes, or a nurse. A nurse is perfect,
Yep,
right?
no matter where you go in that wildlife world, they can get a job, or vice versa. But that,
agreed.
yeah, that kind of happened for me. My wife's not a nurse, but she's in a job that would travel if I chose to travel. So that one's okay. So thank you for that introduction. I do like that. I think for me, for someone in academics to have that management orientation, and for you to have that management background to work for the state of Maine, I think that's quite an asset, right? Because you have that genuine curiosity about why or how, challenging the norms, but then you come from that applied background, so it all has a purpose, and that resonates very well here at Delta, and I think that's one of the reasons why you've been kind of our go-to colleague in the Atlantic Flyway. So appreciate you spending some time here with us. We're going to cover 3 bigger topics. We're going to talk about your duck migration forecast series. We're going to talk a little bit about eastern mallards and this cool thing called stable isotopes that's kind of taken over my mind in terms of kind of unraveling some of the mysteries of duck production and sources of duck populations. And then you have some current work going on here using the stable isotopes to investigate green-winged teal, gadwall, and wigeon breeding areas, if I have that correct.
Yep.
And so we're gonna unbox one of those one at a time. This first one is really exciting, Mike. If you've listened to, it would have either been 2 or 3 podcasts ago, Delta introduced this concept of duck distribution, and we talked about 5 pillars or buckets of reasons why duck hunting or waterfowl hunting seasons maybe have been quite different over the last 5 to 10 years, as opposed to some of the more what we'd call normal, for those of us of our age, and explaining some of the shifts and challenges that hunters are starting to experience. And weather is one of them. Agriculture, weather, changes in, I guess, onset or severity of winter, things like that. And so I think your duck migration forecast series really taps in nicely to this duck distribution concept. Can you talk to us about this? And I think there's a couple big things here. You have a website, right? foulweather.co, but you also have a podcast. Can you
Correct.
Can you introduce the listener freely? Introduce to both that you have going on there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it was one of these things, like, for years we were doing like we did kind of migration forecast through Mississippi once we came up with the weather severity index stuff. And then I fooled around with a YouTube channel for a little bit. And then I just got to a point and I was like, boy, the variation in this weather every single seems challenging to hunters, and just decided to, either go big or stay home. Right. And so I worked with some folks that did helped design the web page, and it's like my graphic design and kind of motion picture team, if you want to call them that, and just decided to actually do the kind of go big thing and see where it landed. And it's been great. It's the Foul Weather Podcast. We do a migration forecast every Monday morning for the next 7 days. So this isn't a migration report. It actually tells you where ducks are going to be in the coming week using an algorithm that we published in 2010 in the Journal of Wildlife Management, which basically includes some pretty simple stuff, but does pretty good job of explaining duck migration is, but how cold is it? How much snow is on the ground? How many days in a row has it been cold? And how many days in a row has there been measurable snow that would interfere kind of with field feeding? And so we use that algorithm to predict movement of all the species of dabbling ducks, pretty much, other than like blue wings that get out of town early. And we've kind of got an experimental diving duck algorithm that we talk about too. And we produce this forecast for all 4 flyways for the next 7 days, and we do that every week, October through the end of January. So pretty much everybody's, duck season's out there, other than the folks like way far north that start in September they're on the breeding grounds, basically. That's where the ducks are at. So, and then we cover all types of different content on there that affect waterfowl community, including breeding conditions and elsewhere. So that's really what the Fowl Weather Podcast is. We kind of jumped off a bridge. It's grown really, really well. We've got a massive listenership and increasing sponsorship and stuff. And the biggest thing that we really focus on, Joel, is sticking to the science and trying to make sure that we produce high quality information to inform waterfowl hunters about what's affecting duck migration, what's affecting duck populations, and what's affecting duck habitat.
Mike, with let's say a new hunting season is upon us, you can talk about that season, week by week, what to expect, how the weather impacts different species, migratory patterns, timing, things like that. I want to look at that just a little bit, but I also want to ask this bigger question. Do you have a longer term view of changes in migration that have taken place over time, or is it just, or are you just focused on? Of course, you're focused on 1 year, but have you been able to look at longer trends, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years?
Yeah. So 2 ways to think of that. So long term, there's the within season long term forecast, which we do, right? There's I'd say, newest and greatest, best information from seasonal climatologists. The folks, I published a paper with the guy, Judah Cohen, who coined the term polar vortex, as far as I know, right? So we work really closely with those folks, and we kind of almost have insider information to some extent about what does the winter look like coming up. So if you're going to plan a time to go, should you go in December? Should you go in the first week of January? Should you go in late January? Those things are a little hit or miss, right? But we've done really well the last 2 years at kind of nailing that. But then the long-term stuff, we've used the algorithm that we developed, the Weather Severity Index, and gone back 1980 till 2019 was the paper that we published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, and looked at trends in that weather severity index and how far south that weather severity line, like as think about this, as the snow line, the temperature line moves south. Some years it's way up here. In Minnesota, way late in the season. Other years it's like comes down to the boot heel of Missouri earlier. And so we looked at where that line was through time from 1980 to 2019. And that line has moved north. So that basically gives a lot more area where birds can stay where they haven't in the past, right? So the weather, the severity line that would cause birds to migrate south has shifted north pretty substantially, to the tune of like what we estimated between 1980 and 2019 was 1.65 million mallard-sized ducks could stay further north than they used to in the Atlantic and Mississippi flyways. Now, if you consider the continental population, it's 6.5 million. Well, let's traditional survey areas say 6.5, 6.6 million. As soon as you say 1.6 of those can stay pretty further north than they used to, that's the kind of thing that can start affecting your ducks in front of your blind, right? So what I've seen is, it's has the weather changed? Has the food on the landscape changed? Has the pressure changed, right? There's lots of things that change at the same time. But the way I always say it is I don't care how much food you've got. If there's 2 feet of snow and 2 feet of ice, ducks don't stay there.
They don't
right?
stay, no.
So that's the kind of thing I feel like we've tended to measure is that, and it's become milder. But the one thing I will tell you, and this is where the Fowl Weather Podcast really works, is that there's still a ton of variation among years, and there's a ton of variation in the timing of the weather that really pushes these ducks. And that's what we're trying to offer people is what is the best day to hunt in the upcoming week for you to go? so that you can increase your likelihood of success of fresh ducks in front of your blind, because everybody knows at southern latitudes, if you have periods of time without weather and you're shooting the same ducks trying to shoot the same ducks every day, and you're hunting every day, your numbers of ducks in front of your blind and your success typically plummets. And so what we're trying to do is find those, provide people with those days that are the best days to hunt. And there might only be 5 to 8 of them a year, honestly, that are really, really good. But rather than go every single darn day and then be frustrated with your season, go less, be more successful, and be more satisfied. That's the hope from it, right? So, and the positive feedback we get, Joel, is awesome from listeners, So, I say it, and people probably think it's a ploy, but it is not. I have been increasingly using this algorithm the podcast takes a ton of time. My job at ESF takes a ton of time. I've got honey-do lists and stuff like that too. It's not like I can just run out and hunt every single day. But what I tend to do is pick my days to hunt based on my own algorithm. And I'm going 50% less and shooting twice as many birds on those days that I go. So I averaged 4 birds per hunt last year in the Atlantic Flyway. I mean, that's pretty darn good.
You're doing something right.
I think most people would be happy with that. So yeah.
So help me with this one. So you said October is when you kind of kick off the forecast series?
We start doing the long-term thing in we do teaser stuff in August, and then I do because here's the thing is most of the long-term forecasters for winter weather are really worried about that depth of winter and how that's going to affect the citizens of the United States, right? How it's going to affect cities, how it's going to affect plowing, your driving, recreation, like ice fishing, all that stuff, right? So that tends to actually be more of a January, February, March type event that happens where it gets really nasty. So I stick my neck out early on, and then really the official forecasts for long-term late in winter come out in like first week in November. And then I work with those folks, get that information, gather, some of it's just available on the internet too, gather that, and then think about it in the sense of how a duck would react to it, and then provide a second long-term forecast. So we stick our neck. Last year I stuck my neck way out in August just as a teaser for fun, because the patterns, some years the patterns in these long-term atmospheric cycles are so obvious that I can start to forecast it in late July and August as to what in general is going to happen. But you can't really tune it into October, November, because when you're that far out, there's still things that can happen that people didn't see coming. But by November 1st, it's a pretty solid forecast for December, January at that point.
Who would you say who's your primary audience? Because I'm in North Dakota, right? And we'll hunt in Canada as well. So when you're talking October, November, we're done already. Or November, right?
Right.
So are you talking more mid-latitude southern duck hunters?
Yeah, for sure. Mid and southern, but I do speak to you on years when I might say we've had years where you're going to get a cold front. There's a high likelihood of a really strong cold front. There was something October 20th 2 years ago, you got snow and all that. But then the likelihood of that existing in long term is low. So then you all warmed up, and your big ducks were around, your geese were still around, and those birds hung on for a very long time after that, right? But for the most part, it's mid-southern latitude folks that is the audience across the flyways until you get out west. In the west, Pacific Flyway is screwy, right? It stays just warm and wet, all the way into Washington and Oregon and parts of it for a long time. So that's one we're still kind of feeling out. Our algorithms work for the central Mississippi and Atlantic flyways really well. I asked for feedback from those Pacific Flyway folks last year, and they kind of said, yeah, you're hitting the major movements, but the locals, like the reshuffle stuff, I can predict that pretty well when there's rain events and flooding and things. Those are outside of my algorithm. That's just me knowing ducks, right? But the Pacific Northwest folks said, we hit the major movements pretty well, because they're still getting those folks are still getting ducks out of the prairie and parkland region that go over the Continental Divide and show up there too. So yeah,
You bet.
But yeah, it's mostly mids mid-latitude and southern folks for sure.
And that makes a ton of sense. Where we are here in the Dakotas, yeah, we're experiencing the weather events that other people are keeping tabs on. And we're not that far from Canada. We can see that in our own local forecast even. We can see what's coming to the north. You had mentioned that you do this forecast for various species, and for the benefit of the listener, that's obviously because different species will migrate. Different factors will cause them to migrate. Can you kind of talk about some of the variability? I would imagine a mallard is on the extreme end of being tough and resisting that migratory event. Can you talk about some of the difference in species?
Yeah, we just and black ducks kind of get lumped together. They really do. The algorithm for them is so close it might as well be the same thing. It's within the same variation, right? And then we call everything else the wimpy ducks. And a lot of people call them calendar ducks. And the reality is that's not true. We had a graduate student at Long Point years ago look at, and it's the same thing we did when we worked with the Missouri data. When we originally came up with the WSI when I was at Mississippi State University, we tested calendar or photo period against the weather variables, right? In weather variables, we're always better. So even though a gadwall, when your season opens in Mississippi, is already there, it doesn't mean that weather didn't affect it. It just means that the weather was severe enough to a gadwall to already be in Mississippi when your season opens. So everything other than mallards and black ducks tend to migrate earlier. They really go like shovelers. Shovelers are first. Green wings are in there, even though it's weird. Thing where it's very truncated because they'll exploit cornfields and things like that. So there's some green wings that'll hang on, but for the most part it's shovelers and green wings kind of about the same time moving. Of course, blue wings are already out, right? Mm-hmm. They move much earlier, much ahead of everybody else. So we don't even consider them. Actually, they are a photo period or calendar migrator for the most part. They do adjust some, but when you put it up against weather, they're going from a place they're never going to stay to a place that is right. The Gulf Coast, Central America, South America, Puerto Rico, places like that. So they just leave when they can. So they are real, true kind of calendar migrants, and they've been adjusting a little bit, even given that that's majorly what they do. But it goes shoveler, green wings, wigeon, gadwall, pintail. Pintail might even be before gadwall. I can't remember. But then like the one that we really monitor after that, like once that movement happens, it's kind of those ducks, you just got them, right?
Right.
And then it's really tracking mallards and black ducks at that point. And those are the ones, it takes a lot to move them. Almost everything else starts to move like at or below or just below freezing. Or before freezing even for some of those early ones. And then mallards and black ducks, I mean, it takes several days of freezing temperatures and snow cover to move them. Their peak generally, if somebody was looking for a peak at your location of the most mallards or black ducks that would show up, it's when the WSI is 0, which basically means your mean temperature is 0 degrees. That's going to be your greatest increase in ducks is around that time. So, but it takes a lot to move them out after that.
I would imagine that this product in your podcast, obviously there's high entertainment value in just monitoring and participating in this, but have you collected some feedback and testimonials of people who have actually had the positive hunting experience by listening to you? Yeah,
I mean, we're getting a dozen a week. Emails, Facebook Messenger, stuff like that from folks that just said, man, you were spot on. I think I'll just leave it at that. Like that's pretty much the feedback we get. We do have a bunch of doubters out there that say this has nothing to do with weather and duck populations are just low. And I'm like, well, yeah, duck populations are low. We all tell me that weather doesn't affect duck migration. You can kind of bugger off. Like, it's pretty obvious there's something there, right? So, yeah.
Yep.
But no, it's very positive, Joel. And that's where, like, I took my kid out of school on Thursday and went our lease and we rested it all week. And we got there, and about mid-morning, ducks just started pouring out of the sky, and these were not local birds. They were coming from sky high, and we were able to pull birds, and we shot limits, and my kids shot like 3 different species. Like, that's the stuff. Like, I don't know. I mean, recruitment, reactivation, the R3 stuff, right? All that. That's part of what we're doing, I would say. I really want to. I mean, hey, it's a business, right? Like, we're getting advertising, things like that. But a lot of this is just trying to get the good word out and help people hunt, because I care about the sport of duck hunting, and I care about wetlands. And I think the more of us we have out there, the better we are into the future with that, the greater number of folks, and the more satisfied folks are when they go. The last thing we want is for people to go out, have a, crappy time hunting, and then not come back to it. So
I agree. I think that's one of the things, and we talk a lot about hunter recruitment here at Delta, and I think one of the reasons, there's some changes in societal values and viewpoints, and moving from the rural landscape to to an urban society, but the other thing is time. Wow, and so I would encourage people to check out, go to foulweather.co. You can find everything you need there, right? You can find out about the podcast, and hey, if you're like most people out there and you're short on time, check it out.
Yeah, and we're on Spotify and Apple Podcast, or I think pretty much wherever you listen, you should be able to find us, and just search Foul Weather as one word, and you should be able to find us. Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Anything you wanted to say about that? More about the...
No, I'm solid. I appreciate the kind of like thinking about this from the science standpoint, and then leading into the Foul Weather podcast product, and just kind of happy it's flowed the way it has. It's just been, again, one of these organic things, and it's fun. You know this, Joel. Like, sometimes you have strategies towards what you do at Delta, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure sometimes somebody comes forward and you're like, let's do that. Yeah. And the Foul Weather podcast was like, hey, let's do that. But if we're gonna do it, let's do it. And I had a little bit of space in my life to work on this stuff on Sundays. So that's kind of where it's at. I'm easily working a 6-day work week with this thing. And so I get Saturdays off, pretty much is what I get. It's fun.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. No, I think that's, having been here, gosh, it's been 24 years. There's been a lot of come and go ideas about migration tracking and migration forecasts. And frankly, if I lump them all together, what most of them have missed, or all of them had missed, is some real science behind it. And Mike, that's frankly what's allowing us to have this conversation right now, is the fact that you've put so much science and thought into this. And hey, I'm going to check it out this fall, and do a little bit of studying, and be happy to give you my feedback. But I'm excited to check it out.
Yeah, no, appreciate it.
You bet. Well, let's shift some gears a little bit. Obviously, you're in the Atlantic Flyway. You've spent most of your life in the eastern quarter of the United States, I guess.
I'd have to think about that. Probably 3, yeah, 8 of them maybe out of it. 8 out of it. 10. Let's go with 10. 10 of 50 years. So, yeah, 4/5 of my life I've been here.
Okay. So for the non-Atlantic Flyway listener, what do you like about the Atlantic Flyway? What do you like? The pros, cons, the challenges?
That's a good question. One that I haven't gotten from folks, I don't think. I like right? I think folks at the southern end have kind of gotten the shaft. Like, South Carolina has been with poor migrations in general. But let me just speak to, like, New York, for instance. We have ducks 365 days a year here. We don't have to wait for them, right? I go for a hike in the Adirondack Mountains, and I see black duck, Canada geese, wood duck. And, even locally, like, there's Canada geese. Well, I shouldn't use Canada geese as an example. They're kind of everywhere. Mm-hmm. But we have breeding ducks here. And even as birds start to move out of Canada and that real kind of preseason stuff, they start to move into New York, like late July, August. Failed breeders, and then even juvenile birds start moving in. And so it's having those waterfowl with us kind of all the time. We don't have to wait for them, I'd say. Opening day is a rip and limit most years. And then it trickles, your early ducks leave and your big ducks show up. And then, availability of water. We have a lot more stable, say, in a lot of places in the East than kind of the mid-continent does. The mid-continent can get pretty dry.
Mm-hmm.
And even on our dry years, we still have water. We're more rainforest than anything. Like, we have one of the wettest, coldest springs we've ever had here at home in central New York, at the farm we live on. It's been miserable. We haven't been able to plant and stuff, but I don't care for lots of water. I'd rather have kind of those tweener years, right? But I think the availability of water, just freelance places to be able to hunt big water and things like that. And that's not true everywhere you go, but I think that's part of it. And then diversity wise, we've got all the sea ducks on the Great Lakes, and then down the Atlantic coast, we still get all the dabbling ducks. And we are the weakest flyway as far as harvest goes. I'd say we might be one of the strongest when it comes to gunning and tradition, say, along the eastern shore of Maryland and, Chesapeake Bay, and then down through some of those southern reaches. There's a lot of rich waterfowling history here. So I think I think I covered it. That's kind of long-winded, but we also shoot less ducks than anybody else. So I think folks have a lower expectation here as well, and are just happy with, whatever we get to a large degree. So, yeah.
That is a good overview. Yeah, I think that is one of the things is hunter expectations was another one of the duck distribution pillars in our podcast 2 or 3 episodes ago. And it's, you can't, that's a tricky thing. How do you tell somebody what they should expect? But I would suggest that if you've had a couple decades of really, really successful hunting seasons, frequently going out there, putting 4, 5, 6 birds in the bag on a daily basis, and now you're experiencing a trend of just the opposite. Hey, like I said, I think expectations have been set, but that's interesting talking about your part of the world where expectations are more moderated by just kind of this norm. We have good days, we have bad days. Maybe we're just happy to get out there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll tell you this, like when some of the rivers around us flood, like this is going to sound weird. The best timber shoots I've ever had have been an hour from this house.
Okay.
Not within the time that I've lived here, way before when I was in university. But when it's good, it can be really, really good, but the consistency of it is way lower. So you don't expect it every day, right? That's the biggest thing. And we don't hang our hats on mallards. I'm not a mallard purist. Man, I'll take, 4 greenheads and 2 black ducks every single day, but that's not the norm. But those days that it does happen, it feels that much sweeter, So I think that's one of the things we get into, and we've put the greenhead on such a pedestal that we forget that all these other species are pretty awesome too. And table fare wise, they're reasonable enough, if we're going to do that comparison. And so I think one of the things I'd like folks to do is kind of think about how cool gadwall and shovelers and wigeon and these other species are, and consider them, a reasonable substitute if your mallards haven't shown up. And that sounds like blasphemy to folks from Arkansas.
Isn't it?
But,
yeah.
But it's reality. Like if they're not there and they're not showing up, make hay with the species that you got while the sun shines. So it's still great camaraderie. It's a great day in the marsh, and you're still killing ducks, and they're, I don't know. Don't be like, oh, it's only a gadwall. It's kind of sad to think of it that way. It's a cool duck. I mean, in South Carolina, it's the new mallard. So
I suppose it is. My 2 favorite, and if I had to pick a favorite, I think I'd pick green-winged teal. But my top 2 are green-winged teal and wigeon. I think it's just kind of a product of where I grew up, and then when I moved west, and it was just, oh my gosh, all the different types of ducks to harvest. And I think I've had a couple of those a couple of my more memorable hunts, I
Mm-hmm.
was into the green-winged teal, heavy. It was
Yep.
foggy. I couldn't even see them until they were about 25 yards, and it was pretty cool. So I think it's probably more of an experience that got me to love
Right.
that particular duck so much. But I think everybody probably has a little bit of that, maybe a duck camp vibe around mallards, or maybe it's big water
Mm-hmm.
canvasback, something like that. In this, getting into our second topic here, Mike, the eastern mallards and stable isotopes. Growing up, I always thought of the Atlantic Flyway. I always thought of of black ducks, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that at, at least at large, the conversations about mallards kind of dominate the discussions and the regulatory discussions in your part of the world. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I guess until recently, we went to the multi-species model for seasons, right, and moved away from the straight up mallard model because it wasn't it. The other species were doing something totally different, and it was becoming less and less of the bag for a lot of states. Now, New York, 25% of our harvest is mallards. You go down further to south, and it's like 10, 8, 7% of their harvest. So folks wanted the other species in there, like Florida shoots a ton of ringnecks, right? So the Atlantic Flyway moved away from that a few years ago, but it has played historically a huge role in the decision-making framework, for everybody across this continent, I'd say.
Yeah, I think focusing, there's a couple flashbulb moments in time. One was the 2019-2020 hunting season where bag limits for mallards were reduced to 2, and then moved back up to 4 in that 2023-24 season, if I remember correctly. Can you talk about some of the discussion of the reduction and then the increase? Can you talk kind of of representing the management community? What was it that caused those changes?
Well, the population had declined for about 20 years, and to be honest, there was there might have been backdoor discussion, but there was nothing that you could see up front that people were like, hey, let's do something with mallards. Let's figure out what's going on with mallards. Mallards are important. Mallards are important. But I think some of that comes from the northern states. Yeah, mallards are important, but they're not elsewhere. It's not the Mississippi Flyway where they become increasingly important everywhere you go south. And to every state, they're important, right? So I think that might have delayed the hey, we got to do something to figure out what's going on with mallards. I think that folks in the East also thought of somehow mallards would just cycle like they do in the prairies on a wet dry cycle. But as I said before, it's just pretty wet over here, right? And so that population was declining at about 20,000 birds per year for 20 years. We lost 400,000 of 1.2 million mallards in 20 years. And I'm pretty critical of this from the outside, right? And I was part of the flyway, I get it, but you watched it decline for 20 years. And then all of a sudden just reduce the bag from 4 to 2 using this pretty archaic and pretty gross level allowable take model, which is, I think, something that fisheries people use when they have no data. And so I think they were forced to use it. And somebody will call me out after they listen to this if I'm wrong, but this is my interpretation of it. So they did that and then built a mallard model, took and invested a large amount of time with Fish and Wildlife Service folks, and flyway folks that had the analytical wherewithal to work with banding data and other age ratio data and such, and came up with a model and said, okay, well, we're okay to go back to 4 because guns aren't running this, is right. But they had to do the safety mechanism thing, right? They had to do something because I don't think they could just continue at 4 the whole time. And I know there were lots of discussions about could we go to 3 with 1 being a hen, or what other combinations are there, right? But I can tell you this, because on those days I go and that mallard migration's happening that we predicted, I'm shooting 4 mallards. So I can tell you pretty much what it did for me was put 50% less food in my freezer.
Yeah.
And in my mouth. And I'm a charcoal grill with apple smoke and all that stuff, whole ducks on the grill. And neighbors come over, hunting partners come over and hang out for the afternoon, have a bourbon on the porch, do the grill thing. That happened 50% less.
That's a way to look at
So
it. Yeah.
there was implications of this. I sat in on a flyway meeting, and there was like a survey that went out, and they asked folks how much less they went hunting, or how many fewer people hunted because it went from 4 to 2, and the decline was like 14% of hunters. I was like, okay, we already have a problem. And then like they're like, well, if it goes to 1, it goes to like 37%. And I'm kind of pulling these out of my arse, these numbers, but it's about what it was. There was no balk at losing 14% of hunters for the season because it went from 4 to 2. And I'm like, I don't know. I feel like that's fairly significant to lose 14% of your hunters with a single management decision that probably in the end did nothing to save mallards. Right? If shotguns aren't running this population. So that's a long-winded way. That's more maybe opinion-based with some science sprinkled into it, but it didn't help the mallards. They had to do it. I'm sympathetic to their situation. But did it hurt duck hunting long term? No. Right? Was it good? No. So, I mean, there's a lot of layers there that we could peel back, but that's kind of the overall take on that, 4 to 2 and then back. But Joel, one of the things I'm going to talk to work that y'all are funding too, several layers, and we'll get into stable isotope stuff a bit, but we're actually looking at when in those 2 years when it went to 2 and you shot your 2 mallards, right? There's some assumptions here. When you shot your 2 mallards, the likelihood that you could shoot more mallards was probably relatively great if you already shot your 2. Mm-hmm. So if you did that and then shot 6 ducks or 4 ducks, what were those other birds? Like how much did we actually put pressure on wigeon and what was that trade-off? Or in some areas across the Atlantic Flyway, there aren't other ducks to shoot, right? You're shooting mallards or wood ducks kind of in some of these places, right? And so how often did this person used to shoot 4 mallards, but it went to 2 and then they didn't get anything else, right? So how much did we, like you can go through those with the parts collection survey where we collect the wings and stuff and start to think about what was the trade-off. If you didn't shoot mallards, what did you shoot? Or if you didn't shoot mallards, how much less of like if you're a place that only had mallards and you could shoot 2 when you could shoot 4, how much did that reduce opportunity too, as well, to be out there longer?
Do you have information for that?
No, I don't. We're going to work on it.
But that's
going to be
stuff.
Super. Yeah. It's going to be very difficult to do, I think, analytically, with some assumptions. But we're at least going to go down that road with a graduate student and have her, calculate that stuff out and at least be in a thesis. We'll see if it's publishable.
So you had the years where bag reduced to 2, and then you were talking about there was a modeling exercise specific for the Atlantic Flyway that allowed basically at least the populations that have occurred since then to go back to the 4 mallard bag. If I understand it right, kind of barely above that threshold to allow the continuation of 4. What is the general trend? Obviously, it's still down again, or talked about that.
It went up like after COVID, it like jumped a little bit, but it's nothing substantial. And as far as I know, like it used to be split up between Canada and the US. And I don't know, it's a new calculation, I guess, but it used to show the US population declining and the Canadian population stable or flatline. And now it's just a composite population estimate. So we can't see those. But the thought was, or what I heard was we gained a bunch of mallards kind of in like Eastern Canada, and I don't know if that's at the detriment of black ducks or not, but like that might just be kind of a new colonization event happening over there too, where there's just a short-term bump in that population. But I don't know, like I think that the model is it. Where I get to with this is like, yeah, if guns are really running this and we're really driving this population, then fine. Like maybe we have to go down. But if they're just dying anyway and dying in the, the breeding season and harvest isn't running this, then are we hurting ourselves by taking away that opportunity from hunters and continuing to recruit hunters, right? With bag limits that folks find satisfying. That's the trade-off I've never seen, the questions I've never seen answered, right? And the comment is always, well, we got to take care of the waterfowl first. And my comment always is, well, if we don't have the hunters, then we ain't going to have the waterfowl in the long run. So you can't throw that one out. You can't not consider it in the decision-making process. So I think they're working on it, but I'm going to be probably a critic if the bag limit goes back down, because our indication is that, you know, harvest isn't really driving this, that the if there's any change in survival, it's during the summer, or it's based on reproductive output. So it has nothing to do with that harvest season.
Yeah, that conversation is coming. When you're staying above the 4-bird threshold, we can avoid that conversation. But you're right. We're actually the other way of talking about that. If we're just above that threshold, the second we get there, now the real conversation starts. And one of the things that, you know, yeah, responsible harvest, responsible regulations, we're all in the same conversation here. But what role does hunter harvest play on duck populations? And I agree with you. That's our tendency, is to lean towards hunting is not, you know, modern, well-regulated hunting seasons are not driving down duck populations. And so there are situations where the duck hunter can be punished unnecessarily. And so, yeah, I'll be looking for that conversation. We'll probably be participating in that as well. One of the spin-offs of this whole mallard situation is this stable isotope analysis. And rather than me try to give this explanation, why don't you describe to the listener, to the duck hunter, what are the stable isotopes in the first place, and how do they apply to this whole conversation of where do mallards come from?
Yeah, this is a cool one, and I've talked about it in several ways, and I'm not a stable isotope analytical person, right? Like, that's not the entire world I live in. It's a tool that I'm using to understand the origins of where ducks are hatched, or where they molt their feathers. But the basics of it are that there are ratios of heavy to light hydrogen isotope. We could just say deuterium, right? But heavy to light, and that varies predictably from south to north across this continent based on the level of precipitation. Okay, and so that signature, just think of it this way, that signature is in the water, and it differs by latitude from south to north. So now when those bugs live in that water and they ingest that water, or the plant takes up that water, and then the duck eats that heavy to light isotope stays the same. It degrades a bit throughout the food chain, but we can predictably understand that, how it changes, okay? Now, that hydrogen is also a building block in the proteins that go into all the tissue in that animal. Now, it turns over, right? So in your blood, it turns over really quickly. It's like 12 to 24 hours or something like that, right? So that's just going to give, if we sampled your blood, it would say where you lived in that last little period of time. When a duck grows a feather, that feather stays in that duck until it's molted the next year. So a duckling growing a feather in, at Delta Marsh in Manitoba holds that signal of that heavy to light isotope for the whole entire year. So you can shoot that duck in Louisiana, cut a piece of the feather from the flight feathers, and sample it, and it will give you a value that you can link back to a known, say, hydrogen map, and within 200 to 300 kilometers, say where that duck came from. So that's the kind of short of it, and hopefully that makes sense to folks.
I think it does. A question, genuine question from me: does this technology work, or the growth pattern of the feathers, does this work the same for ducks that are hatched that year as adults, or are we just looking at hatchier birds?
Wherever that duck molts the feather, it works. Okay. So we can take adult female feathers and compare it to where juveniles came from. If they don't all fail, like those hens don't fail nesting and then go fly somewhere way different, right? Adult males we do not use for the most part, because once they're done breeding, they're just delinquent, right? They go off in like molting parties, we call them,
Right.
and they'll fly like hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, and and then molt way away from the breeding where they were breeding. So we typically, if we really want to know where ducks are coming from, where ducks are produced, we use birds that hatched that year and then were shot in that next hunting season immediately.
Okay.
To get that signature out of their feather. Yeah.
So you can narrow it
and
down
that's what we
that
did
far.
with those mallards that we worked with y'all with. Yeah.
Okay. So then I think we're going down the, people hear me, I for some reason I put things into buckets or I put them into funnels. And so our conversation is coming down a funnel. So we're going to go a little farther down the funnel. Is that, I think if I'm a duck hunter, I'm listening to this, I think of, I shoot a duck with a band, and I get a certificate that tells me where that duck was banded and how old it was, and maybe it's a hatch year, maybe it's an adult. I think a duck hunter thinks that's where that duck came from. Mike, what I've learned through this whole process is they're not always in agreement, right? Where a duck is banded is not necessarily where it was hatched. Can you describe that, the difference between those two?
Yeah, and we actually had a graduate student, Harvey, she's now a waterfowl biologist for the state of Maryland, who did just that, looked at where a duck was being captured and banded across the Atlantic Flyway in the Mississippi Flyway with mallards, and then took a feather and looked at how well that matched with that isotope map, because that feather sample, if that bird was produced locally where it was banded, should be within that 200-kilometer range. It should fall in that range. But what we actually found in this, I'll use an example in central New York, right at the lake near the university on Onondaga Lake, we're catching ducks that had a signature of Ottawa, Ontario in like the beginning of September, late August, well before weather would push these birds. I remember sitting on the shoreline one day with her, and I'm like, man, it was like we got all the first year's data in, and I looked at it, and I'm like, this can't be right. Like, I can't believe that like 50% of the ducks we're banding are coming from Canada to central New York, thousands of kilometers to be banded. And what happens but a school bus, an absolute slob of a Drake black duck, just a stud Drake black duck, lands right in front of us next to the trap. And I'm like, well, that pretty much does it, because we don't have breeding black ducks anywhere near us. At least 100 miles or so into the Adirondack Mountains. So for sure, these birds are moving, right? And then we started to think about it too. Like, it's early September, pintails, greenwings, wigeon, all start showing up at the National Wildlife Refuge down the road. And I'm like, these ducks don't breed here. They're way far away from here. And I'm like, what makes us think that a mallard isn't doing the same thing, right? They're all dabbling ducks. If you go to Long Point on the North Shore Lake Erie on opening day, which is the third week of September, you can shoot just about, other than cinnamon teal, like every dabbling duck species in North America. There's no weather that's really pushed them. These birds are making initial movements off of breeding grounds in the boreal parkland areas into probably more productive soils with better energy resources. And they're going to sit there for a long time until weather event, basically pushes them out after that. So yeah, where you band a duck doesn't mean that that's where it originated from. So I think that what's cool is that the feather portion, the stable isotope portion, kind of gives us a picture. It's not to say banding is wrong and that we shouldn't band. It's that these two things inform each other, is what it is.
Well, I think banding, obviously, you get some indication of a harvest rate. You can get that, right? But I think maybe one of the trappings of saying where it's banded is where it came from, is when you're targeting conservation actions. And that's a huge conversation that we get with people interested in investing in Delta, in duck management as a whole. They say, I want to invest my money, my time, if I want to volunteer or get a job, whatever it might be, into where I know my ducks come from. Well, if the only source of that information to date has been banding data, again, great stuff. It's
Mm-hmm.
state of the art in its time, but the stable isotope work can allow us to target conservation actions maybe more appropriately. Bringing it back over to the mallards in the Atlantic Flyway, you had already said, if I understand it right, that really in the regulations setting or the model don't differentiate between a Canadian mallard and an American and a
Right.
U.S. mallard. But what did you guys learn something new? Did you find that Canada had more or less of an impact on the population that you
Mm-hmm.
expected? What did you find there?
Yeah, so this was a Delta project that y'all funded several years ago, and the question was, where are eastern mallards originating from that we harvest? So we went to the Harvest Information Program data to understand what states are shooting these mallards, what percent, and then we looked at sampling like 600 ducks per year, evenly distributed. So, if a state shot 10%, then 10% of 600, we were trying to get feathers from those states so that we had a, nice even distribution. We ended up with, I think, a little over 1,200 samples in total. And what we did is we went to the Parts Collections Survey Wing Bee, where like folks that have ever mailed wings in, we went to that, and then we kept just grabbing hatchier birds. We went like as the folks identified species sex. Whenever a hatchier mallard, a juvenile mallard came across, we opened that envelope, pulled a feather, put it in another envelope, we needed to of where it came from. And so what we ended up with was about a little over 1,200 birds from the Atlantic Flyway from Maine to Florida over a 2-year period, and then ran stable isotope analysis like we talked about and looked at where they came from. And what we determined, and that's the Sam Cushia's project. He is now a PhD student with Josh Stafford at South Dakota State University doing some really cool stuff in the potholes with drain tiles. So kudos to Sam for really running this project, doing a great job with it, and as a master's student, getting it published almost right away. But what we found through that stable isotope analysis was that 66% of the hatchier birds that were harvested in those 2 years in the Atlantic Flyway came from Canada, and 33% from the States,
Wow.
right? So 2/3 and 1/3. Well, here's what's interesting. When you look at the survey data, it's flipped. So that only 1/3 supposedly of the Canadian population of eastern mallards is in Canada, and 2/3 is in the US. So there's a couple choices there. Either there's way more mallards in Canada than we're counting, which is possible that they're in places that we don't survey, or the US production is in the dumpster, and we're just producing that many fewer ducklings per hen in the US for some reason. That would explain the population decline in the US, not producing enough individuals on a given year to replace your deaths. So that's what we found. It's kind of floating out there in the wildlife management world as a publication, and it'll, we'll see. There's a lot of other work going on with mallards now, which is great, and we'll see where it all lands.
So is kind of the jury still out on you floated out 2 hypotheses or 2 theories. Either there's more mallards in Canada than we expected, or the U.S. population is just doing that poorly. Is the jury still out on which one?
I think so. Yeah, I do. I mean, there's a bunch of telemetry stuff going on now, GPS stuff in the Atlantic Flyway. That might tell us, the answer. It may agree with it. It may not. It doesn't mean either data stream is wrong or right. This is a body of evidence thing, Joel, and you know that too. I think the thing that we just haven't done enough of is enough work with eastern mallards to understand them as well as we understand prairie mallards, for sure.
Well, they haven't been investigated as closely, as an eastern population for as many years as your traditional survey area.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's awesome. Now, the stable isotope work continues, but working now on green-winged teal, gadwall, wigeon. So I'm guessing it's the same concept, or at least the same science and technology. What is the motivation or application of this particular investigation?
That's up to y'all because you funded it. I mean, you can tell me what your motivation is.
This is a test, Mike. This is a test.
This is a test. But So a colleague of mine, Jackson Cusack, who was in Keith Hobson's lab at Western University in London, Ontario, now works for Canadian Wildlife Service out of Ottawa. As part of his PhD work, looked at pintail derivation, like where do they originate from? Like when you shoot a pintail in the Great Lakes, where do they come from? And what he found was Hudson Bay lowlands, James Bay lowlands, and up towards the Ungava. That is, eastern pintails are a thing, and pintails we shoot in the lower Great Lakes, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and through like the New York Lake Plain and in southern Ontario are actually coming from the east. We also find a lot of that in the stable isotope work we did with greater scop. And this is something we just submitted from a master's student that worked on Eastern Long Island. And a large portion, larger than what we would expect of greater scop, are coming from Quebec into that northern portion of the Atlantic Flyway. Our lesser scop, actually the same thing. A greater proportion of lesser scop are coming from, at the northern portion of Flyway, are coming from Quebec. So my interest in working with, I got a delivery, so if y'all hear dogs in the background barking, those are my yellow labs. I apologize. It makes the podcast authentic.
We do like the dogs.
But my comment always is like, we don't really do a good job of banding and recording ducks coming out of the boreal, out of Quebec, and out of kind of that taiga and subarctic area. So I think actually portions of the Atlantic Flyway probably derive a lot more birds from that part of the world. And I think we've just missed that completely in surveys and otherwise. And so my interest in greenwings, gadwall, and wigeon is understanding to what extent they're coming from the east instead of elsewhere. And I think greenwings for sure, that's a thing. We've got breeding greenwing populations even into the eastern Maritimes to a large degree. Gadwall I'm skeptical of, but I know they breed on the St. Lawrence River between New York and in Ontario and Quebec, and in abundance on those little rocky islands and stuff. There's gadwall all over the place. It's kind of something you don't think about, but it's not like the prairies. It's nowhere near that, right?
Right.
But then when you get down further south, I think those birds, like South Carolina, let me just go with South Carolina, I think, and then Georgia, Florida. Their birds are really coming probably out of the prairies. But the connectivity between central New York, like the Montezuma Wetlands Complex, the Finger Lakes, southern Ontario, and the Mattamuskeet region in North Carolina is really strong, I think. So that kind of, there's almost like two flyway things going on probably, I think, with these birds, is that these greenwing, gadwall, and wigeon, in the New York down to North Carolina region are probably largely more eastern than what we think. And then the ones, the further you get south, are probably coming out of the prairies. But that's like a hypothesis, and we're going to be able to test that to some extent. Now, here's a caveat with that. Remember when I said that stable isotopes are really good at differentiating north to south?
I was going to ask that question. What happens east to west?
They suck east to west.
Okay.
They suck.
Okay.
And so this is what we did with the scop, is we did what we kind of, I got to come up with a name for it. It's like trajectory direct recovery. So what we do is you just draw a line from the southern point of James Bay, which kind of separates like an eastern Canada population from everything else to the west, right? And if you band a green-winged teal in North Carolina, and then next October it gets shot in North Dakota, if you band it in the winter in North Carolina, and next year it gets shot in North Dakota, it probably didn't breed in Quebec. But if you take that bird from North Carolina that you banded, and then the immediate next hunting season, it gets shot in New York, southern Ontario, it's much more likely it came from the east. So what we do is we look at banding data through time using all the bands we can to figure that out. And then you can weight that isotopic signature east to west of James Bay. And that's like the gross scale that we're using, right? Now, here's the thing. Could a duck go from North Carolina to Manitoba and then get shot in New York and you infer it to be having come from Quebec? Yeah, there's error in this for sure. But it's a way to start to weight that stuff. The scop, man, it's really obvious. Like when we did it with the scop, those northern birds are coming, they're getting shot up in the Ottawa River Valley. They're getting shot over in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, stuff like that. But as you go down the flyway, they're just getting shot before they even get, they're way over in Missouri, Dakotas, upper Miss River. And so the distribution of those is really skewed to the west, and then we can weight that stuff. So it's a way to do it. One of the, like, green wings, we've got enough bands to really do it well. Gadwall and wigeon, we don't. And this is also, I can see it already in the data, likely going to be an argument. We should just probably be banding more ducks and supporting banding operations at massive scales greater than what we are.
One of the things that I've kind of been sad about at times in my career is people have studied, pick a critter, people have studied it extensively for decades, right? And I've kind of felt like how exciting that must have been to been on some cutting edge frontier. But here we are, 2025, and I'm a bit jealous. You're doing some frontier type research, right? And you're adding to. Who'd have thought that in 2025 we're just kind of learning about the basic life history of duck species that we've known so well and had such a close relationship with for decades. So kudos to you, and I'm excited. When will some of the results, do you think, be available from the green-winged teal, gadwall, wigeon work?
So we have a young lady, Izzy Egan, who had worked for years. She went to Stevens Point, University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, great wildlife program, and then worked 4 years for the Wisconsin DNR, and now has come on with us as a graduate student, and just taking such initiative with this, Joel. She actually, so Cornell University is where the stable isotope lab is, where we just usually send feathers for analysis. She's driving down there because they're backlogged. She's driving down there on a daily basis. It's only like an hour from us. It's not that bad. But she's actually prepping the samples. And she's already got like 200 samples prepped of those that we collected this year. So she's like a third. I can't remember our total sample size, but it's like 600 and some. So we're going to be, usually we wait 8 months for these. But there's a possibility by like the end of summer that we might see like preliminary, data from this stuff. There's going to be 2 years of it. We have other collaborators at Nemours Wildlife Foundation. South Carolina folks have really gotten together, and they are increasing their sample size themselves and have helped match the funds that y'all put into it. Canadian Wildlife Service collected some for us as well. So Chris Nicolai's mailing those over to us. He's got those. So I think we're, in good shape to have initial data. So let's just be a little conservative and say by the end of the year.
Under promise, over deliver, or something like that.
Yeah. And then it's a master's project. So there's a thesis that goes with it. So we're, this stuff's 2 years out. I mean, these things don't happen overnight.
Well, to the listener, stay tuned. Maybe we'll bring you back on here. I guess in closing, Mike, thank you so much for your time. You did a great job explaining all this information. I think the listener will feel that way too. Just kind of on our way out here, can you just give the listener just quick, how do they find you? Again, just, I know we did it at the front end, but let's close with it so they can keep track of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. We've tried to be pretty active on social media and stuff too, but I'm at SUNY ESF. So if you just Google, ESF, SUNY ESF, and then my name, that'll kind of get my profile at the university and such. And then the foul weather thing is the podcast and the migration forecast that we do. I also do private consulting for wetland management as an extension of that. I'll even plan your deer food plot for you if you want, but I only do northeast stuff because it's all I know. But just trying to find a way at retirement to actually still make some money and have fun in the outdoors. So that's kind of the plan there. But we're on Facebook at Our Waterfowl. That's just at Our Waterfowl, and that's for the ESF Waterfowl and Wetlands program that we have. I think I'm advising 13 students now, so it's gotten pretty big. And the Foul Weather Podcast we're on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, Apple, all that stuff. So we're pretty easy to find, I think, at this point. Kind of spread out and spread thin.
Fantastic. Well, Mike, thank you for your time. And I guess I just want to reiterate, thank you for being our partner in our commitment to leading smart, cutting-edge applied waterfowl research. So with that, we'll get you back on here at some point.
Sorry.
No, it's all right.
I was gonna say thanks y'all for, really, Delta's been, I guess, a rock in my world over time, right? Like, if I didn't beg my way in for 1 month of work with Dr. Frank years ago, I don't know that I'd be sitting here talking with you today. And then just, all the support for these students that you have produced. I mean, these kids go on to great careers in waterfowl and wetlands. So kudos to what you're doing and keeping duck hunting important in this country. So thank you.
Absolutely. It's not always easy, but nothing good is typically that easy, right?
For sure. It's a full-time job, man. It's a heavy lift. I always say it's like pushing a big boulder up a very steep hill on a daily basis, but it's worth the effort.
Well said. Well said. Thanks, Mike. You take care.
Thank you.
You bet.